How many are these actually making? Now, I want to show you something else. This is the list of the agencies that Barack Obama has created in just the first year, in just the health care bill. Sorry it's taking so long. I just want to show them to you. This is just in one bill. I can see now why they're trying to get you to make videos on the benefits of regulations, because I have news for you. There's a whole lot more regulation headed your way. And as history tells us, that's not a good thing for the little guy. Progressive reforms have failed over and over and over again. I'll show you some more of them and what could be our future next. Before we went into break, I was telling you about the Ferris Tire Company, and I want to give you a little bit more information because I think I actually got the ending of that wrong. Ferris was on the verge of having to fire everybody. He didn't actually have to, because at the 11th hour, another brave group of guys who owned a chicken, a butcher shop, challenged the NRA. They took their case to the Supreme Court and won, which struck down the law. In the 11th hour, as he was getting ready to fire them, the Supreme Court said, what FDR is doing is unconstitutional. Big government is seemingly the solution to all of our problems. It comes from the progressive idea that the government can rescue us. Actually, they believe offer redemption. That was the idea in the early 1900s. Social justice, redemption for all. The idea is that the government's job is to fix the ills of society and redeem. They think, or thought, that they could actually regulate or legislate morality. I thought liberals said you could never do that. Where did they learn that? Oh, from the government regulation from the early 1900s. The progressive era reforms that everybody likes to point out and use as evidence that it works. Do you remember Prohibition? The biggest progressive reform. How'd that work out? We have been taught that those reforms saved the little guy from the greedy big businessmen and saved the country. That's what we're being taught again today. It's not true. Many of those things in the 1900s, early 1900s, were actually based on racism. Woodrow Wilson was the biggest racist you've ever seen. And it actually pushed small businesses out of business. They were unconstitutional, and some had serious unintended consequences. Paul Moreno, he is the Associate Professor of History at Hillsdale College, Senior Fellow at the Kirby Center for the Study of the Constitution, and author, I can't believe, why don't I have this book yet? Black Americans and Organized Labor. We have to have you back on to talk about that. Okay, let me, I guess, start with this. We are being told now that if we just give more federal regulation to our banks and our financial industry, that these kind of crashes will stop happening. Obama says if we don't do this, we'll have another crash. Isn't this exactly what people said in the progressive movement with the Fed? Isn't that why the Fed started under Wilson?
Absolutely. The principal reason for establishing the Federal Reserve System was to avoid the periodic banking panics that the American economy had before 1913.
But it was more than just the banking panics, right? It was the crashes. A free market system, as Kondratyov under Stalin taught, it goes in waves. It will crash and it will renew itself. That's where green shoots come from, right?
Absolutely, okay. And there were the recovery from these panics was usually very fast. It was the Great Depression in 1929. In large part, many economists say, because of Fed mismanagement that was so long and so deep.
What is going to happen now with this new regulation? What are we looking at with this new regulation? Is there anything in history that you can look to and say this amount of regulation is good or bad?
Well, if you look at the creation of the Federal Reserve System in 1913, even though the progressives, Wilson and his advisors, said that this was meant to prevent what they referred to as a money trust or a money monopoly that was centered in Wall Street. It was actually the big bankers who were moving for a system like the Federal Reserve System, not the one that they actually ended up with. And it was precisely because they were afraid of increased competition from small and especially state banks that these big banks were actually losing market share going into 1913. And it ended up shoring up the power of the biggest banks after 1913.
It strikes me as, for the first time in American history that I know of, and maybe you can correct me, that we have been saying that they're too big to fail. We've always been for the underdog, at least outwardly, but now we're not. And it strikes me as the people with power, the people with money, are just going to have more power and more money with this new regulation.
Well, one of the things you see with federal regulation over the years is the tendency for the industries that are supposed to be regulated end up capturing the regulating agencies and molding them to their own purposes. And they often find out that it's a very convenient way to have federal regulation help them eliminate competition from smaller competitors.
Yeah, it's interesting how we're doing all this stuff, and Google is involved, and Microsoft is involved, and all of the big industries, and we just don't see the little guys. Okay, back in just a second with more. With Paul Moreno. He is the Associate Professor of History at Hillsdale College, Senior Fellow at the Kirby Center for the Study of the Constitution. Paul, we're hearing all the time now that this is a moral. This is akin to the Civil Rights Movement. This is a moral issue. We have to do these things. And it's always an emergency. You don't want to waste an emergency. In 1910, the Mann Act. This was the white slavery. There was a big scandal, and people were afraid that there was white slavery going on, and women were being sold into slavery, et cetera, et cetera. And it was a moral issue. We've got to act. It starts out even with the best intentions. What happens?
Well, even with the best intentions, and even if you were in favor of a moral regulation, the question is, of course, under the Constitution, what government has the power to deal with these sorts of questions? And the Mann Act was really monumental because it was the beginning of Congress's establishing a police power, the power that traditionally had belonged to the states. So even if you did think there was a big problem with large-scale, commercialized prostitution, and there really wasn't in 1910, a lot of this was sort of progressive muckraking hysteria. Still, the question of
New York was pretty bad. I mean, whether this is the Tenderloin, what is it called, the Tenderloin district?
Yeah,
was very bad. Anyway,
but a lot of the reformers depicted this as if this was a problem with big business again, that this was a vice trust that existed that only the federal government could deal with, that this was beyond the power of the states. And a lot of members of Congress who still had some sense of constitutional limitations disputed this and said that this was an unconstitutional usurpation.
So what happened in the end to the Mann Act?
Well, Congress passed a bill that ended up punishing people not just for commercial prostitution, but for transporting women across state lines for any immoral purpose.
So wait a minute.
And so
if you weren't married, and you said, hey, let's go to New York, and you lived in New Jersey, and you came in and you brought a woman into a hotel that wasn't your wife, and you did immoral things with the door closed, were you prosecuted, or could you be?
Yes, that was a federal offense. More than that, if you so much as bought a railroad ticket for somebody who wanted to go on and have one of these affairs, you were liable to prosecution.
America, this is where you can't legislate morality came from, to do a good thing under progressive government. Back in just a second. Gandhi said, use truth as your anvil, nonviolence as your hammer, and anything that doesn't stand the test when brought to the anvil of truth and hammered with nonviolence, reject it. Have a good weekend from New York. Good night, America.